Hi guys. My AC is really loud, but I'm getting a new one. So also, I finished the book of Joshua, and I also finished the book of Judges and the book of Ruth we read a while ago, but I reread it just because I want to go in order. So now I'm in the book of 1 Samuel. But if we go back into Joshua was one of the people that made it into the promised land because he was right with God, right? So all the other Israelites lost their privilege of going to the promised land, but Joshua didn't. And so when he made it into the promised land, he essentially had to continue to guide the Israelites into not worshiping other gods and to focus on the one true God, right? In it, I saw so much of myself because there was things that God was calling me to that he had been calling me to do for so long, but my spirit wasn't aligned with him. I was trying to do things my own way, and so they kept failing. And it wasn't until I really honed in with God and I really started focusing on my relationship with God that all of his promises to me started to take fruition. And it made me just extremely grateful. I feel like I had this fear of getting closer to God and losing myself and losing who I am, and it's scary, right? God's pruning you, so it's so uncomfortable. It can get so hard and it can get so heavy, and there's a lot of spiritual warfare, and the enemy's trying to convince you that it's all a lie and that just all of these things, right? And so you start to buy into those things sometimes. Not really. I'm like, no, but there are moments where it just gets so overwhelming. You're like, I just want this to stop. And so in the book of Joshua, it was blatantly clear all of the things that I needed to do to be obedient to God. Sometimes we can minimize the things that God is calling us to do because they seem like, oh, it's not a big deal. I can do it whenever, and right? But we can't minimize what God calls us to do because each step is a step closer to the great things that he has for your life. So what he's calling you to do can feel so minimal and so small, but in reality it is the stepping stone to the greatness that is your life, that is your calling, that is your purpose. And so the book of Joshua just really solidified, I gotta do what God has been telling me to do for over a year, right? But also that year wasn't in vain because God was preparing me. He was preparing my spirit, he was preparing my character, he was preparing all of me in every way possible. And not only me, but he was preparing those around me that are a part of my obedience, because a year ago they were not who they are now. Growth is so essential with God. Obedience is so essential with God. And so the book of Joshua really highlighted that. And in one of the verses, let's see if I could find it, but even just off memory, God tells Joshua, I cannot take you to your promised land until you take the people I have designated to you to their promised land. So there are people in your life that you have to take to where they need to go before you go where you need to go. Life isn't about a selfish experience. It's not about me, I, what I want. Yeah, you have the desires of your heart, and that's okay, and you can give those to God and trust that he's gonna do everything in his power, and he is all powerful, right? So it's gonna happen if the desire is on your heart and it's in alignment with God, meaning it doesn't go against God's character, right? There are people that God will send to your life that you have to take to where they need to go. And even if those people aren't ready, or if those people are acting out of character and stuff, sometimes the work is praying over them, is speaking life over them, is preparing them emotionally, mentally, even physically sometimes, to get them where they need to go, and having all the patience in the world and knowing that even if it takes forever to get them to where they need to go, it's not going to take away from your blessings, from your abundance, from your promises, from the years that God has promised you that the swarming locust took away from you, right? So be obedient to God. It is so worth it. He loves you so much. So at the end of Joshua, we see that Joshua definitely got the people to where they needed to be, and then he got his abundance and his blessings, and he got his promised land, which was so beautiful to see. Then we get into the book of Judges, where things start to get really tough because the people of Israel start to really struggle with keeping God at the center of their life. So we see a lot of the ups and downs, and At that time, they started appointing judges to essentially assign consequences to the people that were stepping outside of God's will and abundance for their life because they were sinning and just doing things that they shouldn't have been doing. So in the book of Judges, we see how difficult those times were and how they were really trying to discover what are the appropriate measures that should be taken in order to hold these people accountable. And then we also meet Samson in this book. Samson in the Old Testament is essentially like Superman, right? He is so strong. Anybody he goes to war with, anybody he goes against, he wins because he has so much muscle, he has so much strength. There is just so much about Samson, except for Samson's weakness was his inability to truly put God at the center of his life. He depended on his strength. He depended on himself in a lot of scenarios, and that ultimately led him to his death. A little backstory about Samson. He got married. His wife was given to some other men, and so she ended up having relations with other men, and that broke Samson's heart. So then he ended up going to a prostitute, and he was with her, and then eventually he met Delilah, who essentially got him killed because she kept asking him, what is your strength? What is your strength? And he would tell her something that wasn't true. And then she would tell the people that were trying to kill him, like, oh, this is what's going to kill him. Like, this is how you're going to be able to kill him. And they would fail because he wasn't telling her the truth. But you would think, right? Like, oh, she's trying to get you killed, man. Like, don't tell her the truth. But he ended up telling her what his strength was. And it was that he had really long hair. And his hair was the reason why he had that strength. So essentially, he couldn't have a razor put to his head because that would take away his strength. So eventually, he did end up telling Delilah this, and she told the men that were trying to kill him. And so right here in the excerpt, it says, Superman's Flaws, a morality play starring Samson. So in chapter 16, verse 28, it says, "Oh God, please strengthen me just once more and let me with one blow get revenge on the Philistines for my 2 eyes." So the Philistines ended up taking out Samson's eyes, and at the end of his life, he ended up getting his revenge by taking all of them out with like a huge pillar of one of the temples, and he ended up dying also. They definitely tortured the poor man because of Delilah, but he was in love with her, and so unfortunately, yeah. Okay, so this is what it says. It says, "The most famous of all the judges makes an appearance toward the end of the book, and the Bible devotes 4 chapters to the soap opera-like events of his life. If Gideon shows how God can use a person with limited potential," Gideon was spoken about in chapter 7 of Judges, and he essentially was a man that was very insecure and didn't really have anything going for him, but God used him in a mighty way. Samson, on the other hand, illustrates just the opposite. A person with enormous potential squanders it. So there are people in this world that have so much potential to live a life with glory, with God's glory over themselves, but because of their like limited trust in God, because of their ignorance, because of so many factors, right? They are not going to do anything with that potential. It kind of just sits dormant and they die. So it says, when Samson enters the picture, the Israelites are once again suffering under foreign domination. The Israelites keep finding themselves in a lot of controversy, essentially, in a lot of situations that are really detrimental for them because they keep being disobedient to God. So God's protection keeps leaving them because God cannot protect what is not righteous. God protects what is righteous. That is why our obedience is so essential. Our obedience is not out of force. Our obedience is out of our love for God, but it also keeps us protected, which is important if we want to live like great lives for God. So then it says, the Bible makes clear that God has an important mission in store for Samson and wants him specially set apart as a leader. Indeed, Samson is blessed with supernatural gifts. When the Spirit of the Lord comes upon him, he can tackle a lion or single-handedly rout an entire army. And yet, as the stories from his youth reveal, Samson wields that strength in ways more befitting a juvenile delinquent than a spiritual leader. Samson's character was that of a juvenile delinquent that had a lot of strength because he kept making really bad choices and just doing things that he should not have been doing. Then it says, ending with a twist. Like any rebellious teenager, Samson selects for his wife the kind of woman sure to cause his parents and God the most grief. When that marriage barely survives a week, he next takes up with a Philistine prostitute. This chapter describes how he stupidly forfeits his great strength in a dalliance with a third woman, the seductive Delilah. Samson's story is like a morality play. No one in the world could match his physical strength. Just about anyone could match his moral strength, because it was very low. His moral lapses would seem almost incomprehensible were they not repeated by spiritual leaders in almost every generation. So what we see in this sentence is that it would be more baffling to us to be like, wow, I can't believe how much Samson spiritually failed, right? But because spiritual failure has been a part of our world history, generation after generation, it's kind of like, yeah, well, that's kind of expected by mankind. Mankind tends to not hold themselves to a high regard when it comes to their spiritual abilities. They tend to just focus on the physical world and what they can attain physically here in the world. They don't care about the spiritual realm, and that ends up being their demise, because everything is spiritual. Everything that manifests in the physical first happens in the spiritual realm. Towards the end of Samson's life, it appears that the pagans and their gods have soundly defeated the God of the Israelites. Just appears that way. But Samson and God have one last surprise for the Philistine oppressors, and that's where the pillar, after they gouge his eyes out, he takes them all down, or a significant amount of them down with him when he dies. But his life wouldn't have needed to end that soon, or the way that it did, if he would have had more of a spiritual connection with God. And then in the book of Ruth, we see a woman that was not an Israelite. Her husband died. She had a sister-in-law also whose husband also died, and a mother-in-law who was a single woman. And so they all depended on these two men to really support them. And so when they died, they were left like, what are we going to do? Ruth, instead of fearing for her life and saying, I can't go with those people, I can't go with you, Naomi, I have to go my own way, she followed Naomi. She's like, where you go, I will go, and where you stay, I will stay. Your people will be my people, and your God, my God. Where you die, I will die, and there I will be buried. May the Lord deal with me, be it ever so severely, if anything but death separates you and me. When Naomi realized that Ruth was determined to go with her, she stopped urging her. Because initially, Naomi was like, I can't give you another husband. Like, I can't have more kids. You know, by the time, even if I did have kids, by the time they were adults, like, you're not going to wait for that. And, like, just go find yourself a husband with the Moabites. And Ruth was like, no, I'm going with you. And they end up in Boaz's field, right? And so Boaz was a very wealthy man, and he was one of the Israelites. Boaz took favor with Ruth. He saw her, and he saw how hard of a worker she was, and how she was a good woman with good morals and a good character. A biblical man is a provider, right? So the Bible says that a man that doesn't provide for his family is worse than a non-believer. So if you really sit with that, it's kind of hardcore, right? Because it's like, wow, a non-believer, like, isn't that essentially to God the worst thing you can be? No, there's something worse than that, and that's a man that does not provide for his family. And unfortunately, I've seen a lot of that in my lifetime, of men that do not provide for their families, or men that hate to work, or men that are just not a provider man. And the destruction of the family unit under that kind of mentality is detrimental. It's detrimental for the children. It's detrimental for the wife. It's detrimental when a woman has to take on the authority of being a provider, because it's not in our nature. God will give us the power to do so when times are tough, but that is not his plan for us. That is not his desire for us. His desire is for the man to be the provider, and for the woman to be the nurturer of her family. And now, I'm not talking about women that have a higher calling, right? Like, for example, even for me in my own life, right? I'm getting a higher education than most people get in their lifetime. I have a plan to have a career. I have all of that, right? But I know that if God gave me a family, my children, my husband, my family will come before all of those things. Those things have purpose in my life, but my children will take precedence, and my husband will take precedence over my children, because it's God, husband, wife, children, right? The husband and the wife are equal, but the husband is the head of the household. And so Boaz is essentially painting that picture of a man of God that is a provider, that saw Ruth and said, this is a woman of noble character. This is a woman that could be my wife. And so he goes through this pretty lengthy process of making her his wife, because she wasn't an Israelite. She was a Moabite. He had to go to the townsmen and go through this whole civil matter to be able to make her his wife. And so he did what he needed to do, and then he provided for her, and he gave her a really great life. From their lineage came King David, which we will later learn about the mighty works of King David. Yeah, that's the book of Ruth. So now we're going to get into the book of Samuel, and I will update you on that when I'm done reading it. So yeah, love you. Hope you learned something.